And good morning. You've reached Profiles and Perspectives. I'm your host, Annual Rogers. And today I'm going to go ahead and characterize this as our Black History Month edition of Profiles and Perspectives. I'll start by telling you a short story here. This is a very personal program today, um, but it's also a very historic program. Back in the year 1900, Dr. Booker T. Washington started the Negro Business League. And my cousin, James Ransom, uncovered a, a transcript of the 16th annual conference of the Negro Business League, which was basically in 1915. And then, to our surprise, included in the transcript was a speech that our grandfather, our Garfield DeVoe Rogers Sr., gave, where he talked about his business. And so, as a notion of what we're talking about in terms of profiles and perspectives, I could not think of a better opportunity to talk about the history of Negro business going back to 1900, to talk about some of the various business people that were at that conference. It was held in Boston, Massachusetts, and to also talk a little bit about legacy, and so to share some legacy and some insight in terms of what specifically comes out of my family, and with the hopes that other people are going to say, "Hey, I've got some great stories I'd like to be able to tell and like to be able to share as well." So if you are watching this on Facebook, I've actually put up the image of the actual annual conference, the front cover. But there's more to this. So what I've done in terms of this morning's program is I've asked two of my cousins, James Ransom and Keith Cromartie, to join me in this conversation. So James and Keith, good morning.
Good morning.
Morning.
So let me give you all a little bit of background on the Negro Business League. As I said, it was started in the year 1900 by Booker T. Washington. The 16th annual conference was held August 18th, 19th, and 20th up in Boston, Massachusetts. Some of the speakers that were up there, and for those of us in North Carolina, C.C. Spalding, who started North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company, was one of the speakers. But just to give you a sense, these people came from all over the country. There was the J.E. Walker, the president of Delta Penny Savings Bank in Mississippi, S.G. Willis from Fredericksburg, Virginia, who was a pickle manufacturer. Florence Franklin from Cambridge, Massachusetts, was a caterer. You had Mrs. F.J. Weaver from Kansas City, Missouri, who was a florist. Philip A. Payton Jr., a real estate broker out of New York. And then you had the presidents of the National Negro Bar Association, which is now called the National Bar Association, the president of the Negro Press Association. You had the president of the Negro Funeral Directors Association. So all of these people had come together to talk about the state of Black business. The last piece that I just want to share before we actually kind of delve into actually some of the things that took place at the conference was in the book. They summarized some of the things that were taking place across the country. So they were looking at the period from 1900 to 1910. And they said from 1900 to 1910, Negro businesses, and I'll call them that's what they framed it at that point in time, there were 20,000 Negro businesses in 1900 and 45,000 of them in 1910. We went from 2 banks to 51 Black-owned banks in that period of time, from 250 Black-owned drugstores to 695 Black-owned drugstores. They estimated that the domesticated animals, so farm animals owned by Blacks, was 85 million in 1900 and had grown to 177 million by 1910. The value of the land that we owned, the African Americans, Black folks owned back then, went from 69 million to 272 million dollars in buildings, land and buildings. and so there was this tremendous momentum taking place at that during this time period. And so that's the kind of the basic backdrop of this conference that took place. Um, and so with that, James, why don't you talk a little bit about what prompted you to go looking for this information, and a little bit of what you found in terms of what our grandfather had to say.
So, what prompted me to do the research is that our family has so much history, and delving into stories that we heard about, trying to get verification on some of these stories was what drove me to do more research. And I had heard stories, about our grandfather walking to Florida and what he did when he got here and his accomplishments once he got here. But I mean, he came from a family of 15 brothers and sisters in Georgia and walked to Florida in the early 1900s and landed in Bradenton, Florida with just 90 cents in his hands at the time he did that in the early 1900s. So what he accomplished that led to me doing research were things that I heard about, that we heard about as young children, because he died before we were born. And in doing the research, there's actually documentation that supports things that we heard about his accomplishments. So I learned a lot doing that. That's my motivation.
So the legacy that we bring to this, and by the way, guys, let's not treat this like it's an interview by me. Let's just talk, okay? So when we get together, you're not waiting for me to ask you guys questions. Let me just also note that I am the junior member of the three of us. And anybody who thinks that I have a gift communication, they'll quickly find out that two of these guys can talk rings around me. So, so what I really would just like to know is, again, and Keith, you can kind of jump in here. We've heard about our grandfather, GD Rogers, all that he accomplished. Um, and actually, let me just let me go back to James just for a second. Share a little bit about what he said in his speech in 1915, because he told us some very specific things that were remarkable for a guy that had said he'd only had 11 months of education and was about 30 years old.
Yeah, so at this meeting, this organization that you were talking about, the National Negro Business League, was formed. The founder was Dr. Booker T. Washington. So when they convened this meeting, he was engaged in conversation with some of the attendees, and during one portion of this meeting, this conference, he introduced our grandfather, who was talking about how he combined being a merchant tailor and farming and real estate and insurance in being successful in doing that. So one of the things that obviously struck us is a lot ahead of that, but he says that his present home was in Florida, going there nearly 8 years ago. On the 31st day of December, he arrived at the depot with 90 cents in his pocket. He was then 22 years old when he landed in Manatee County just before the panic. And he talked a lot about what he did after that, which included owning a tailoring business. On the farm, you had to learn how to sew, you learn how to cook, do a lot of things. So he had some basic skills. But one of his good friends, who happened to be my godfather, Alan Jones, taught him how to cut fabric and sew fabric and make suits and clothes and so forth. So he owned a tailoring shop back then. He also sold 230 copies of Negro literature. Some of the books he sold were written by Dr. Booker T. Washington at that time as well. But he went on to talk about just not his cleaning and pressing and tailor business, but also his love for farming. So he leased an acre of land back then, and ultimately he just made money doing that. So in the latter part of 1907, he opened a cleaning and pressing establishment. These are his words, by the way, his actual words in 1915. This being almost a novelty to the people there. This is our grandfather talking. He said, I did well, being the only one in town with about a population of 1,800, and it growing all the time. In 1908, I added a tailoring department and began the first tailoring business in Manatee County, which is in Bradenton, Florida, the city he was in that county. made clothes for all the well-to-do white people as well as colored people. Now, of course, that's the way we described each other back at that time. There was applause during that meeting from the people attending. He said, I first employed two first-class tailors, one Mr. Allen Jones, who is with me now and attends to all of the tailoring business when I'm away. Having been raised on a farm, I could not resist the temptation of that good black soil. So I rented 1 acre of land, put it into celery, meaning grew celery, which produced 960 crates or 3 cars, train cars, which brought something like $600 a car. After I cut the celery off the land in February, I planted 1 acre into tomatoes, which brought $600. After the crop of tomatoes that came off, and got a crop of peas, grass, and he went on and on to talk about the things he did in farming. And later on, I can tell you more about what he did, after that. But these are his actual words, which really moved us because, it's one thing to hear a story, but it's another thing to actually read. Right now, I'm reading the words he said in 1915 during that meeting, which is really remarkable.
Keith, when you think about the stories that you heard about our granddad, what are the things that, well, why don't you kind of bring this story kind of more into what he did after those early days? Because he became really a very prominent business person in the state of Florida from the beginning in the tailoring business.
Yeah, what I can add to this is that it was not lost on me in my younger years growing up in Bradenton, Florida, Manatee County, the sense of community that our grandfather, he's y'all's grandfather, he's my great grandfather. I'm the first great grandchild. So, the sense of community, I mean, all through my life, I heard time and time again what Mr. Rogers did for the community. He bought an old courthouse that they were going to destroy and moved it to the Black community and started the first school for African American kids. Kids back then went to school to 8th grade, but there was no school for Black kids until he started that. The other thing that impacted me was that as a kid hearing these stories is that I've never heard anybody say one negative thing about him. And he was a man of character and a man, a benevolent man, a man who no matter what your stage in life could relate to you. I hear people talk about I've heard people talk about they didn't have money to pay him for a funeral or for some kindness. And they would pay him back with a crate of tomatoes or some eggs from their farm or oranges. And that was acceptable. And that's salt of the earth. It did my heart very, very well that you all allowed me to be the keynote speaker for the elementary school that was named on his behalf in our hometown, Rogers Garden Elementary School. So I mean, I'm a little older than you guys, and I have some reflective, and I think I spent way more time in Bradenton than you guys did, and I have some reflective moments where elderly people were telling me what a great man he was, firsthand knowledge from folks.
Yeah,
I'm
go
going to
ahead,
jump.
Jay.
I'm going to jump in and say, even though Bradenton was his favorite city because he considered that the New Jerusalem for him for the family, he lived in Tampa and Bradenton.
Right.
So when he expanded his business interests, he went from having 90 cents in his hands to accumulating 14 houses within 8 years from arriving in Bradenton from 1907 to excuse me 1907 to 1915. He accumulated 5 acres, 14 houses, several different kinds of businesses. But later on in 1922, he founded an insurance company, Central Life Insurance Company, because Black people, and it was, we lived on one side of the tracks, at that time in history, and it's pre-1960s, but he actually found out that Black people couldn't afford funerals. They couldn't afford even a decent burial. So he created a debit insurance company that grew to be the largest one in the state of Florida, Central Life Insurance Company. And with the business income he was making and profit he was making, he bought thousands of acres of land, including in Tampa, where he donated land for a public park where only at that time blacks could go legally and safely. They couldn't go to public parks with whites. So along the Hillsborough River in Tampa, he bought land that later was, part of it was used as a golf course built by blacks who couldn't play with whites at country clubs that they caddied for these white golfers, and they hand-shaped and built 9 holes of golf on a course that later became a par 72 PGA style course in Tampa, which is still there now, and we've helped to make sure it's preserved in the perpetuity because the land was owned by our grandfather, and it's now a historic site designated by the U.S. Park Service in Florida. But aside from the funeral home, he had a hotel in Tampa, Rogers Hotel in Tampa, which is a destination for folks traveling. Jekyll Island, there was a motel on Jekyll Island. It was the Dolphin Inn, 3.5 miles on the Indian River and 2.5 miles on the Atlantic Ocean at Bethune-Volusia Beach. Just so much that he accumulated. But to Keith's point, one thing he did was he was very philanthropic. He was always giving, and he would take people from Bradenton that he didn't have to drive anyone. He took people from Bradenton to Tampa, drove them to work, and picked them up after he left the insurance company business and brought them back home. And he didn't have to do any of that. He was that kind of person. He was amazing.
Yeah. My dad taught, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Keith.
My dad speaks to that helping hand, the relationship Bradenton and Tampa. My dad's mom was a nurse at a hospital in Bradenton, and she had relatives in Tampa. He would drive her back and forth all the time. But one point, I'd like to look beyond this for a historical thing that we ought to just keep in the back of our mind. He was starting this business insurance company funeral home thing in 1922. What happened in America in 1921? In 1921, a horrific thing happened to the Black community. Black Wall Street happened. Flourishing Black business out in Oklahoma, right? Yep. Were destroyed that year. And you can't help to know that all of that was part and parcel of his psyche or within his realm of thinking. And I don't know if he saw that as threatening or stepping out and moving beyond that. But Black Wall Street really stays with me because how horrific it was. And it just dawned on me that our grandfather was starting his business months or a year after this horrific event happened out there.
We're having a conversation about a piece of history that we have uncovered. I've got Mr. James Ransom and Keith Cromartie there, two of my cousins. Booker T. Washington started the National Negro Business League in 1900, and we found, or my cousin James found, transcript of all of the speeches that took place in the 1915 conference. And to our surprise, our grandfather, or my grandfather, and Keith's great-grandfather were one of the speakers. And so we thought, it's Black History Month. This is a wonderful time to have a conversation about the state of affairs at that period of time. We're going to take a break here at the bottom of the hour and come back with our conversation. And when we come back, I'd like to have you guys thinking about the kind of educational piece, the connection with Mary McLeod Bethune, the legacy that has caused him to be recognized on the Tampa Walk of Fame, and all the impact that has had in terms of the community. So we're going to come right back. You listen to Profiles and Perspectives with Darswell Rogers.
You good?
I've been running my mouth and I'm on mute, guys. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh goodness. So I went to break and you guys did I okay. All right. Um I had something going on in the background here that distracted me. And I couldn't get this dang thing on Facebook. I usually have no problems, but I recorded it thankfully, so I will post it after the fact.
Okay. So Mark Rogers said he hears us. At least I'm looking at a text that he says he's listening.
Okay. Well, yeah, if you got to the radio station, you could hear it that way, but in terms of seeing it, yeah. Let me share that over, actually. Uh, actually, no, I don't see it here. You can go to the radio station and find it. So anything I want you guys to just kind of flow with this,
Yeah,
I think we kind of got there. We're good with that. Anything besides what I've suggested you think we should cover?
I think we don't. You're talking about a history that would take too long to delve into too many areas. So I think we're doing okay. We're doing all right.
We're doing fine. We'll be fine. Yeah, that connection to Dr. Bethune is pretty significant. I didn't realize my grandmother went to Bethune-Cookman, and as a student, she was Dr. Bethune's aide. Did you know Grandma Louise was Dr. Bethune's student aide?
I've got some information I gotta send to you. I sent you some this morning, but I found another piece of material in her archives at Bethune-Cookman. Aunt Louise Johnson is prominently not only in there, but do you know what GD Rogers was? He was the first trustee that Bethune-Cookman had, and also they deliver food over there, and they also, with the help of Fred Cross' mom and Grandma Minnie, was connected with Eleanor Roosevelt with Miss Bethune. They got the Defense Department to give the school more land for $1 to expand the campus because they didn't have a lot of land. So they had to negotiate that, and Eleanor Roosevelt was the reason that happened.
Yeah, Eleanor Roosevelt came to Bradenton at the Negro Women's Club with Grandma Minnie.
Exactly.
Right there on 13th Street. I know. I used to go to that club. That was a phenomenal.
We really should have been. We should have been represented. Aunt Eleanor for sure should have been there if that was even possible. But when they had the unveiling of Mary McLeod Bethune's statue in DC, our family should have been represented at that moment. I mean, that school would not have been there. It wouldn't have been as successful had we not funded, and we still have an endowment there to this day.
Yeah.
And
my dad was a regular contributor.
And the scholarship is really designated for students only out of Manatee County, by the way. The one that they have now, Eleanor and Uncle Lyle, and that Minnie Rogers, scholarship.
Yeah, I think you're right. You're right. I think that they funded it. If I'm remembering, my dad didn't fund it in his name. He funded it in.
Right. They still want us to do that. And also,
Bethune just hired their new head football coach. He's a Palmetto boy.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Right. Back when Kerry was going there, I don't know whatever years ago, that the president was my dad's classmate.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kerry went to Bethune?
Yeah, for she she didn't like it. She started with Michelle. She and Michelle were roommates.
Wow.
But Carrie did not relate, and I don't think she lasted but a semester, and then she ended up going to Howard.
What year was that?
Something like 86.
Okay, I was out of it. There's a time I was disconnected from military service, away from the family. I wasn't tracking
doing great.
at all.
I am almost done with a radio interview I'm having now on a Zoom thing, so I've got to go back to it. I'll call you back as soon as I'm done. Okay.
Okay, we got 2 minutes and 30 seconds until showtime.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Black History Month, they've got a lot more commercials and stuff flowing than we would under a typical scenario, is what I realized, which is fine.
Yeah,
So you
here's
got
Jan texting. I didn't realize GD Rogers was Keith's great grandfather. And Margot's Aunt Louise is Keith's grandmother. That's fine.
Yeah, well, we get confused because you're older than all of us.
Yeah. By a smidgen. Jimmy, what year are you born? 53? 54?
Yes. 53.
And Doris, were you 56?
58.
58, okay.
Yeah, I just turned 65 in January.
I got shoes that old.
Oh, man. That's funny.
Got shoes that old. Well, at least they have figured out how to hear, despite my. See, I'm going to do most of my programs this way. We got 1 minute. I'm going to do most of my programs this way via Zoom. So I'm going to have to figure out this Facebook thing because I'm actually going to try and really actively work on this podcast. I've had this radio program for 12, 14 years. And I just run my mouth and.
Who's your employer?
Listen, they gave me the time for free.
What? All right.
Yeah. I bring a perspective that's different. And, you know.
Free is a good price. So Kim just said she's on. So you got Kim, Mark, Jan, that I can see are paying attention here right now.
Okay. And welcome to the second half hour of Profiles and Perspectives. I'm your host, Darswell Rogers. I've got two guests with me. They're my cousins, James Ransom and Keith Cromartie. And the reason why I invited them on is that my cousin James found the 16th convention transcripts of the Negro Business League, and this was in 1915 in Boston, Massachusetts. And we uncovered the fact that our grandfather was one of the speakers. And I thought it was a wonderful opportunity here to share with everyone some of the legacy and profiles that took place at that point in time. And Keith, let me just ask you, just from the point of view of this notion of legacy, the dynamics around education, specifically talk about what we, our grandfather GD Rogers did, just as it related to education in the state of Florida, really.
Yeah. So, in spite of having formal education, this man was brilliant. He's a genius, and from you've heard us talk about his business success, but his legacy includes his children who went on to higher education. He's my great grandfather, but he's my grandmother, his oldest daughter, who we call Baby Louise Rogers Johnson, and ended up going to Bethune-Cookman as well as Florida A&M, and she was very linked to Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune as her student aide. And she went on to become a teacher. She taught my mom and me. It was my fifth grade teacher. And she went on to in Manatee County. And she has an international baccalaureate middle school named after her in Bradenton, Florida. That's just his oldest child, his firstborn, who is my grandmother. I can speak to that for days and days. And then you've got your dad, Aunt Eleanor, just on and on and on.
The relationship between Miss Bethune and our and GD Rogers and our grandmother Minnie Rogers was very significant. I think it's fair to say that there were occasions where our grandparents actually were taking food provisions over to the school. James, just share some of that insight in terms of that relationship.
Yes, I mean, the funeral home had, funeral homes have a lot of vehicles, so they were able to take food over to the school, fund the school, and expand the school property from a smaller footprint with some negotiation with our grandmother, who was close with Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was also close with Mary McLeod Bethune, and the National Council of Negro Women, or some organization like that that they formed back then. And with that relationship, they went and got the Department of Defense to give more land for Bethune-Cookman College for $1 to increase the footprint of the campus at Bethune-Cookman College. But the school really survived on the Methodist Church. And so it was a church-funded school, and our grandfather was considered a high churchman by starting a church and being everything at a church, but also the church families basically funded the school. Our family did that. Our businesses did that. But yeah, they took food, shipped food, and had food taken to Bethune-Cookman College. And in the archives of Bethune-Cookman College, there's it's laced with history around our family. Our grandfather was the first trustee in the school history, and throughout the years, so many things happened, including a scholarship that we still have at Bethune-Cookman in our family, an endowment for students specifically coming out of Manatee County. But the relationship with Mr. Bethune was significant. Matter of fact, when our grandfather died, she briefly served as president of Central Life Insurance Company, the company he founded in 1922. So the role and the relationship with our grandmother and Miss Bethune and Bethune-Cookman College is very significant. We also have significant relationships with Florida A&M University and Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia.
And we'll go ahead and throw Howard in there for good measure. Not exactly the same, but we just got a lot of graduates. I can't leave my alma mater out. So when I think about it, and perhaps there's a bust of GD Rogers in the is it called the Hillsborough County Hall of Fame? What's
It's
exactly
a
the
Tampa Walk of Fame. Historical markers are on the River Walk in Tampa, and he was discovered by historians in Tampa to be someone that had to be included in that historical marker that's a part of the River Walk in downtown Tampa.
And so basically, the people that are on the Riverwalk are considered some of the most outstanding people to have had an impact on that community.
The most significant people in Tampa history are on the Riverwalk. He's one of those people.
So we're here talking to two of my cousins, Keith Cromartie and James Ransom. We're talking about our grandfather, really, Garfield DeVoe Rogers Sr. We all called him, everybody knew him as GD Rogers. He passed away in 1952. So we don't have the benefit of actually having known him personally.
It's 51. 51.
51. Thank you. I don't know why I have it 52. But the decision to have this conversation was that my cousin James found the transcript of Dr. Booker T. Washington's 16th Annual Negro Business League conference in Boston, and we uncovered the fact that he was one of the speakers. And in that speech, he explains that he had only 11 months of education. He was about 30 years old at the time. He was born up in Fitzgerald, Georgia, and came down into the Bradenton area. Learned to be a tailor, started to do real estate, ended up delivering mail for the U.S. government. And grew that from that to funeral homes, to burial sites, to insurance companies, to a hotel. And I think it's kind of interesting to take a step here on this hotel. There was a movie that was very popular a few years back called The Green Book, where it was kind of uncovered, and a lot of my white friends were very shocked to hear about this. That if you were black and you needed to travel through the South, there was no place that you were allowed to stay. And so many of the prominent people of that time would come and stay with our grandfather, our great grandfather. And I guess this gave rise to his idea that, hey, there's not enough people's houses to live in. Let me just go ahead and build a hotel where Black folks could in effect stay.
I think
And
it's more
so,
than that, DL. I think
okay,
it was. See, when he traveled and he loved driving, so he would just drive all the way to Pennsylvania. He would just take someone in the family and just go visit a friend or family member. A.G. Gaston in Alabama, he would stay with him, who was another insurance founder of a company. When A.G. Gaston came to Florida, he stayed at our house. But the house in Bradenton had like 7 bedrooms or something like that. So baseball players, Count Basie, different famous people that couldn't stay in hotels with whites would stay like in those homes. But understand this, in Jekyll Island, Georgia, that was a motel. I sent you a picture earlier today on the Atlantic Ocean they owned. A two-story. I went there. It's in Jekyll Island, Georgia, and in Tampa, Bonnet Lake, in the Tampa Bay area near Tarpon Springs. Bonnet Lake Lodge was a lake property with cabins and a lodge on a lake with boats and everything, horses and all that kind of stuff out there. And in Tampa was a 4-story hotel that took up a block, a regular huge hotel building that was in Tampa. So they invested in places that, when we travel safely, we wanted to stay in the same kind of places. So there was a dining room, a restaurant. Rogers Dining was in that hotel. Law offices. They had this was amazing. They had commercial retail office in the same building, on the sidewalk part of the building, pedestrian part of the building. They had offices, restaurants, Black owned everything. So, way ahead of their time. Unbelievable at that time in history to be that successful and be impactful, like Tulsa, Oklahoma, and other cities around the country. Not only Bradenton, there was other places, but we have a direct connection because they were in business that gave us access to experiences that we would not have had people like that not developed those kind of places.
one of the things
Hey,
that's most unfortunate, we've talked about the fact that GD Rogers died in 1951. Um, the 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 capacity of our family, despite all of its good things, to perpetuate that business. This speaks a lot to the challenges with the succession of businesses from one generation to the next, and regrettably, despite some very capable people in the next generation, the insurance company, the funeral homes, and a lot of the land, instead of it having been preserved and grown, over time, it just diminished. And so, when my sister and I went and read, my sister Carrie and I went through and read uh, the speech that he gave in 1950, and our reaction was, we know we got no business ever complaining about life being hard. Because
Yeah.
if you can show up with 90 cents, turn 90 cents into buildings and businesses and all that he did in that period, in that Jim Crow period, you didn't have the right to vote. There was all sorts of obstacles. Then certainly we should be in a position, despite what we have as opportunities, to do more. Keith, your thoughts?
yeah, Jimmy hit on something that I think he passed on to his children and for sure to my grandmother. And the idea of travel and experiencing the world outside of your community, he discovered, and I believe he passed that on. He had a daughter named Modesta who he drove in his car all the way out to California. Unfortunately, she got ill and passed. My grandmother traveled with him all over the country. I know without a doubt that my whole self was shaped by the time I spent with my grandmother, who took me to Florida A&M to first exposure to college graduation, who took me to New York City World's Fair. She had me traveling with her all the time. And what she was doing was exposing and educating me to things beyond that bubble of segregated Bradenton, Florida. And of course, I experienced that going back and forth to New York. But there's no doubt in my mind that our grandfather knew that travel was a phenomenal character building and educational element for us all. And he passed that on to his children, and I'm a recipient of that.
Absolutely, yeah. I remember going on a train from Florida to Arizona by myself with a chaperone. And when I left Florida going to Boston the same way, I had never seen anything in my life but oranges, limes, grapefruits, stuff grown in Florida. And when I got to Georgia, I saw cotton, let's say, peaches. I saw apples and pears. I saw things I never, but it opened up my mind to the world. And so when I went out west, I met American Indians. I met people all across the country going that way and all across the country going north. I'd never seen snow in my life. So I think you're right, Keith. I mean, our family was totally open, that nothing was limited. And I think that became something that he was all about as well. Nothing was limited. I found something I'll send to you from Zora Neale Hurston. She wrote back in 1940 about our grandfather. And he was at a meeting in the Central Florida with businessmen in Florida. And he said, why should we wait for the white man to come and ask us to do X? Let's do it ourselves. That's like 1940. Okay, right. So he was not about sitting around waiting for someone to come and save him and do this or that. He said, let's go do it ourselves, guys. We can do it on our own. And it was great to find that piece of history you referred to, because it was eloquent, and it was a man who had, not much education, but he had common sense and he knew how to make things happen.
It's not a very popular point to make, but I'm going to make this point. We had a sense of community during segregation in our Black communities and neighborhoods about taking care of each other and looking after each other. After when desegregation came, somehow that got broken up, and we under getting better, we kind of left that concept. And certainly it was about survival and an essential need for us to do that during segregation. But I don't want it to be lost on anybody that we had some wonderful things in our communities in terms of us looking out for each other, taking care of each other, sense of community during segregation. It's a catch-22, but I believe it's a point that definitely needs to be expressed.
And I think that's a perfect segue to just kind of circle back for a minute to the growth in Black businesses that's documented in the National Negro Business League annual report in 1915. They talked about this significant growth in African American businesses. What desegregation did was it gave our community the opportunity to go and shop anywhere. And there was a fundamental perception, and there's kind of human nature that when you're denied the opportunity to do something, so then you have a craving or a desire to do that which people said you can't do. Mm-hmm. So if you can go into restaurants and if you can go into businesses that you were denied to go into in the past, so then you want to go and you want to experience that. But that sucked all that economic power, all those dollars that were circulating in the Black community, and it dispersed it across the entire economy. But regrettably, we did not get an inflow of non-Black people wanting to come in and support our businesses. And so there was this gradual decline in the economic prosperity of African Americans as African Americans chose to go into J.C. Penney's or Macy's or the different grocery store versus that took place in our local community. What digress on that very point. I to the day that my dad died in 2018, he always had a Sears and Roebuck card. And I said, why do you keep that Sears and Roebuck credit card? And he said, because it was the only department store that would let a Black person try on the clothes in the store.
Mm.
Every other store you had to take it home, and they pretty much work. I don't know what the story is in terms of whether you could return it, but it was the first store that would let you do that, and he honored them by having their credit card and supporting that business for that one reason.
You know, Joshua, Keith was going to talk a little bit about Uncle Lyle and his interview with him. I know we're going to run
Yeah,
out of time pretty soon.
we got yeah. So go ahead and do that. We got like 2 minutes left, Keith. If you can
Okay,
frame it.
yeah. So, you know, we kind of by default have a legacy of military history. And I'm a retired Army officer. Two sons served as well as we've got a tremendous number of folks who've served, but we've got our great uncle, Lyle A. Gittens, who served in the 92nd parentheses Colored Infantry Division during World War II in Italy. Now, there's a organization who's going around searching for veterans called Witness to War that are doing documentation of these things. And I was able to arrange for them last week to come to Miami and interview our Uncle Lyle Gittens. This man fought in the World War II in the 92nd Negro Infantry Division, Italy. He talked for an hour. He is such a brilliant mind. Touching, talking about combat and those kinds of things. One of his friends who went to college with him was one of the black aviators who got shot down, and he thought he had died. And years later, he was able to find out that that young man had not died. But during this interview, I think touchingly and talking to the humanity and the inhumanity of war, my uncle talked about all sorts of things, combat, logistics, and like he literally cried, and it was the only time I saw him cry in my entire life when he spoke to the children, the Italian emaciated children who were so hungry and so starving that they literally were taking the scraps from the black soldiers' mess kit. A mess kit is a portable plate and spoon. It literally was slop. He said they were coming to eat it from those people. And of course, there was a white infantry division that got there before the black soldier division got there, and they had the Italians believing that the black soldiers had tails, and so there was, there was some hesitancy for them to get to know the black soldiers, but all of that washed out. But great honor, great time, great opportunity. I was happy to make that happen. Thank you.
So we've run out of time here. We could talk and talk and talk. We're going to have to do more of this. If nothing else for the legacy of our family, I want to thank my cousins James Ransom and Keith Cromartie for joining me this morning. And I hope that everybody has an outstanding weekend. We're in the middle of Black History Month. Please take an opportunity to explore the history of the rich history that we have in this country. And with that, we'll see you all next week. Well, you've been listening to Profiles and Perspective with